Divorced mom risked her last $900 on an abandoned home, and what she discovered inside would alter the course of her life forever. The crumbling walls held secrets that powerful people would kill to protect, secrets that had been waiting decades for someone brave enough to uncover them. As she stepped across the threshold that fateful morning, she had no idea she was walking straight into the crosshairs of forces that would stop at nothing to silence her. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Julia Evans stared at her bank account, the number blinking back at her. $900. That was it. Her final lifeline after 18 months of divorce proceedings that had drained her savings and crushed her spirit. The medical bills for her 12-year-old son, Lucas's worsening asthma, had piled up faster than she could manage. And the eviction notice taped to her apartment door gave them exactly 2 weeks to find somewhere else to go. $900 wouldn't get them much in this town, not even first and last month's rent on the tiniest apartment. That's when she saw the county auction listing, a foreclosed farmhouse on the outskirts of town, starting bid $800. The listing had only one blurry photo showing a dilapidated 2-story structure almost consumed by overgrowth. Most people would see a nightmare, but Julia saw their only chance. The courthouse was nearly empty when the auctioneer called out, "The Miller property on Old Creek Road." Julia raised her hand, heart hammering in her chest. $800, she called out, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. The auctioneer looked around the room, clearly surprised anyone would bid on the property at all. When no competing bids came, a strange hush fell over the room. "Oh, going once, going twice. Sold to the lady in the blue sweater for $800. As Julia approached the clerk's desk to complete the paperwork, she noticed people whispering. An elderly man touched her arm gently. "You sure about this, honey? That's the old Miller house. Nothing but trouble since '53. "I don't have much choice," Julia replied, forcing a smile as she handed over her cashier's check, leaving herself exactly $100 to her name. The clerk slid a rusty key across the counter. "Property transfers immediately. Congratulations, I guess." His tone suggested she'd won a prison sentence rather than a home. Walking down the courthouse steps, Julia clutched the cold key in her palm. The metal bit into her skin, and she wondered if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. But what choice did she have? Lucas needed stability, medication, and clean air for his lungs. They needed a roof, any roof, over their heads. As she climbed into her 15-year-old Honda, Julia caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman staring back looked terrified but determined. She'd just gambled everything on a house nobody wanted, a place people whispered was cursed. But curses didn't scare her anymore, not after what she'd already survived. She turned the key in the ignition, feeling as though she'd just bargained with fate itself. The 30-minute drive to their new property felt like a journey into the unknown. Julia gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white as she forced a smile for Lucas, who sat quietly in the back seat clutching his worn, stuffed dinosaur. "Just wait until you see all the space you'll have to run around," Julia said, her voice artificially bright. "No more tiny apartment with neighbors complaining about footsteps. This will be our very own place." "Sweetie." She caught his doubtful eyes in the rearview mirror and added, "We'll make it beautiful together." As they turned onto the unpaved driveway, Julia's rehearsed optimism faltered. The realtor's cleverly angled photos had hidden the true state of the property. What loomed before them was barely recognizable as a house. Peeling grey paint hung like dead skin from weathered clapboards. At least 3 windows were completely shattered, with others cracked or boarded up. The front porch sagged dangerously to one side, as if the house itself was slowly sinking into the earth. "Is that it, Mum?" Lucas whispered, his voice small and frightened. Julia swallowed hard. "It just needs some love, that's all." But love wouldn't fix the gaping hole in the roof or the chimney that looked ready to collapse. This wasn't a fixer-upper, it was a demolition project. Julia parked and sat motionless, staring at what $900, every penny she had left after the divorce, had bought them. With night falling and nowhere else to go, Julia reclined the front seats of her 15-year-old Honda as far as they would go. She tucked blankets around Lucas in the back seat, trying to make him comfortable. "Tomorrow will be better," she promised, though the words felt hollow even to her. "We'll see everything in daylight and make a plan." Lucas nodded bravely, but his eyes betrayed his fear. The house loomed like a monster in the darkness, its broken windows like empty eye sockets staring down at them. A cold April wind whistled through the trees, rocking their small car. As midnight approached, Julia remained wide awake, listening to Lucas's breathing. It started as a small cough, then another, until he was having one of his asthma episodes. She fumbled for his inhaler in the glove compartment, helping him take 2 puffs. Holding him close as his breathing steadied, Julia felt hot tears slide down her cheeks. What kind of mother brings her child to a place like this? The crushing weight of her decision pressed down on her chest. $900 gone, and all they had to show for it was this nightmare of a house that might actually be dangerous. Sleep finally came, but it brought no relief from the guilt and terror gnawing at her heart. The next morning, Julia was startled by a gentle knock at the door. Outside stood a silver-haired woman with kind eyes and a basket of what smelled like freshly baked muffins. "Welcome to the neighborhood, dear. I'm Ruth. Lived next door for 47 years now," she said, extending the basket. Julia accepted it gratefully, inviting her in despite the chaos of unpacked boxes. Ruth settled at the kitchen table, her weathered hands wrapped around the mug of coffee Julia had offered. "You're brave." "Buying this place," Ruth said with a knowing look that made Julia's stomach tighten. "No one's lived here since Beatrice Miller vanished in 1990. Some say the place keeps secrets." Julia forced a smile, though the words sent an involuntary chill down her spine. "I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation," she replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. After Ruth left, those words echoed in her mind as she and Lucas began exploring their new home more thoroughly. The musty rooms held furniture draped in yellowed sheets, like ghosts frozen in time. In the dining room, Julia ran her finger through a thick layer of dust on an antique sideboard, revealing what looked like deliberately scrawled letters underneath. "Mom, look!" Lucas called from across the room. He was examining faded marks on the wall that appeared to be height measurements for a child. Dating back decades, his eyes sparkled with the adventure of it all, unbothered by the eerie emptiness that made Julia's skin crawl. "Can we go upstairs now? Please," he begged, already moving toward the grand staircase that creaked under even his slight weight. Julia hesitated, remembering Ruth's words about Beatrice Miller. What had happened to the previous owner? And what secrets might be waiting on the second floor? The rational part of her brain argued that old houses always came with stories, usually exaggerated by decades of neighborhood gossip. Yet something about Ruth's tone had seemed genuine, almost warning. "All right," Julia finally agreed. Following her son's eager footsteps, Lucas tugged her hand, pulling her toward the staircase, toward the unknown, his excitement a stark contrast to the unease building within her. As they ascended, each step groaning beneath them, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone in the house after all. The upstairs hallway stretched before her, dust particles dancing in shafts of sunlight that broke through cracked window panes. Julia ran her fingers along the wall, feeling the texture of faded floral wallpaper peeling at the edges. The silence felt heavy, almost reverent, as if the house had been waiting for someone to discover its secrets. In a small bedroom that might have belonged to a child, she found stacks of photographs in an old shoebox, faded memories of people long gone, their smiles frozen in time. Who were they? What had happened to make them leave everything behind? As Julia moved deeper into the room, something caught her eye. A drawing on the wall, partially hidden behind a dresser. She pushed the heavy furniture aside, revealing a child's artwork drawn directly onto the wallpaper. The crude crayon illustration showed a woman with distinctly mismatched eyes, one blue, one brown, standing beside what looked like this very house. Below the drawing, in uneven letters that sent a chill down Julia's spine, were the words, "Help me." The handwriting was childish, desperate. Julia touched the drawing with trembling fingers, feeling suddenly as if she were being watched. "Mom," Lucas called from the doorway, his voice breaking the eerie silence. "But I found some old toys in the other." His sentence cut off abruptly as he doubled over, a violent coughing fit seizing his small body. The sound echoed harshly against the bare walls. "Lucas!" Julia rushed to her son, heart pounding as his coughs grew more severe. His face had turned an alarming shade of red, his eyes watering as he struggled to breathe. The dust and mold, how could she have been so careless? She frantically patted her pockets, then remembered with horror that his inhaler was in her purse downstairs. "Hold on, baby," she urged, supporting his trembling frame as she guided him toward the stairs. Every second felt like an eternity as Lucas wheezed painfully, his breathing becoming more labored. This house, her great gamble, her last hope, it was literally toxic to her child. What had seemed like a miraculous opportunity now revealed itself as potentially deadly. As she half-carried Lucas down the creaking staircase, Julia's mind raced with terrifying possibilities. What if she couldn't get to the inhaler in time? What if the house harbored more dangers than just dust and mold? The drawing upstairs flashed in her mind, those mismatched eyes, and that plea for help, sending another wave of dread through her already panicked heart. Julia and Lucas set up a small tent in the overgrown backyard, the evening air cool against their skin. The farmhouse loomed behind them, its weathered silhouette cutting a jagged edge against the darkening sky. Despite her exhaustion, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching them, its empty windows like hollow eyes studying their every move. She busied herself with making their temporary camp comfortable, spreading out sleeping bags and unpacking sandwiches she'd prepared before leaving their apartment. "Mom, this is kind of fun," Lucas said, munching on his peanut butter sandwich. "Like camping, but with a spooky house instead of bears to worry about." Julia forced a smile. "Just for tonight, buddy. Tomorrow we'll figure out how to make the inside livable." As darkness fell completely, they sat side by side on a tarp, gazing at stars emerging in the clear country sky. Lucas pointed out constellations he'd learned in science class, his excitement momentarily making Julia forget her financial worries. Around 9:30, she was zipping Lucas into his sleeping bag when he suddenly froze, his eyes fixed on the farmhouse. "Mom," he whispered, pointing toward an upstairs window. "There's someone watching us." Julia turned quickly, following his gaze to a second-floor window. "What did you see exactly?" "A lady. She was standing there, looking down at us." "Honey, that's impossible. The house is empty," Julia said, though a chill ran through her. "It's probably just shadows from the trees moving in the wind." Lucas shook his head stubbornly. "I saw her. She had long hair and was wearing something white." Julia tucked the sleeping bag around him, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Your imagination is working overtime. Let's get some sleep." Later, with Lucas finally asleep beside her, Julia lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar country sounds, crickets, distant owls, the occasional rustle of something moving through the tall grass. She was almost drifting off when a flicker of movement caught her eye. Sitting up slowly, she peered toward the house. There, in one of the upstairs windows, a faint light moved, like someone carrying a candle from room to room. Julia's heart hammered in her chest. The house had no electricity. She'd confirmed that herself. Whatever was causing that gentle, dancing glow shouldn't be there. For several minutes, she watched the light move, disappearing from one window only to appear in another. It wasn't mechanical or steady like a flashlight. It wavered and flickered exactly like candlelight. Julia pulled her sleeping bag tighter around her shoulders, suddenly feeling very vulnerable in their little tent on the property of a house she knew nothing about. Determined to make the house livable, Julia found herself standing outside the weathered porch of her neighbor, Tom. She'd heard from the locals that he was a contractor who had done work on the house before. Taking a deep breath, she knocked on his door, clutching Lucas's hand tightly. Tom was exactly as described, gruff, with calloused hands and skeptical eyes that assessed Julia as if she were another broken foundation needing inspection. "You're the one who bought the Williams place," he stated rather than asked, wiping his hands on a rag. When Julia explained her plans to renovate, Tom let out a low whistle. "Lady, that house needs at least 30,000 in repairs, minimum, new plumbing, electrical rewiring, structural support in the east wing." His frankness was like a punch to her stomach. "I don't have that kind of money," Julia admitted, feeling foolish for her naivety. "But I can do some work myself. I just need guidance." Something in her determination must have struck a chord with Tom. 3 days later, he showed up at her property towing an old silver Airstream trailer. "It's not much, but it's better than sleeping in that death trap until the major work is done," he offered, avoiding her grateful gaze. The trailer became their temporary home, parked under the sprawling oak tree beside the house. Every morning, Tom would arrive with his toolbox and show Julia basic repairs: how to replace rotted floorboards, patch drywall, and identify load-bearing walls that couldn't be touched. What surprised Julia most was the unexpected friendship that blossomed between Lucas and Tom's teenage daughter, Emily. The girl started showing up after school, initially just to bring her father lunch, but soon she was taking Lucas on expeditions around the property. "Mom, Emily showed me how to identify poison ivy and which berries we can actually eat," Lucas would exclaim, his face animated in a way Julia hadn't seen since before the divorce. One evening, as Julia sat on the trailer's small metal steps, watching the sunset paint the dilapidated house in golden hues, Tom joined her with 2 mugs of coffee. "You know," he said quietly, "I told Martha Williams I'd help maintain this place after her husband died, but she couldn't afford my rates anymore. Always felt bad about that." Julia sipped her coffee, watching as Emily taught Lucas how to skip stones across the small pond at the property's edge. "We're making it work," she replied. "Sometimes family isn't what you expect it to be." Tom nodded, understanding passing between them. Their unlikely foursome, a divorced mom, her nature-loving son, a gruff widower, and his wild-hearted daughter, had somehow formed connections stronger than the broken beams of the house they were slowly bringing back to life. Emily crouched beside a patch of unusual foliage, her fingers gently brushing the serrated leaves. "Mom, these aren't just random weeds. Look at this one. It's wild valerian. And over here, that's blue cohosh. My grandmother used to talk about these, but I've never actually seen them growing before." Lucas, who had been clearing away brambles from what appeared to be a collapsed structure, called out excitedly, "Mom, Emily, I think I found something." The rotting wooden beams and shattered glass panels told the story of what must have once been an impressive greenhouse. "Whoever lived here before was serious about their plants," Sarah remarked, carefully stepping over a fallen beam. "Emily, how do you know so much about these herbs?" "Grandma's books. She was a practicing herbalist before pharmaceutical companies made everything into pills." Emily's eyes lit up as she identified more specimens. Some of these varieties shouldn't even be growing in this region anymore. They were thought to be extinct locally. As the afternoon sun began its descent, painting the overgrown garden in golden hues, Lucas wandered toward the garden's perimeter. His sneaker struck something metallic beneath the soil. "Hey, there's something buried here." The 3 of them worked together, using sticks and bare hands to unearth what turned out to be a rusted tin box, its lid sealed shut by decades of exposure to the elements. After several minutes of careful prying, The lid finally gave way with a reluctant creak. "Whoa!" Lucas whispered, his voice filled with wonder. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. Beneath it was a stack of black-and-white photographs, faces of strangers from another era staring back at them, and at the bottom, nestled in a corner, an ornate brass key with an intricate pattern carved into its bow. Sarah lifted the journal carefully, afraid it might disintegrate in her hands. These must have belonged to whoever planted the garden. Emily picked up one of the photographs, studying the image of a woman standing proudly beside the now collapsed greenhouse, which in the picture stood tall and gleaming with glass panels intact. "Look at the date on the back, 1937. "What do you think the key opens?" Lucas asked, turning the brass piece over in his palm. Sarah looked from the mysterious key to the sprawling house behind them, suddenly aware that the property might hold far more secrets than she'd initially bargained for. "I don't know," she said softly, "but I think we're meant to find out. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from." Julia's hands trembled as she carefully opened the worn leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. The first page bore elegant handwriting, "Property of Beatrice Miller, 1986. She settled into the creaky armchair, feeling an inexplicable connection to this woman who had once lived in her home. As she turned the delicate pages, Julia discovered they were filled with intricate botanical sketches, detailed drawings of plants she'd never seen before, each labeled with scientific names and properties. Interspersed between the drawings were what appeared to be recipes, but written in some kind of personal code. Numbers and symbols replaced standard measurements, with cryptic notes in the margins. Julia noticed the initials, R.P., appeared frequently, always accompanied by exclamation points or question marks, clearly someone significant to Beatrice. "I've spotted R.P.'s car again today," one entry read. "He claims my work belongs to the company, but they don't understand what I've discovered, what any of us have discovered." As Julia progressed through the journal, the tone grew increasingly paranoid. The final entries were written in a frantic, a barely legible scrawl. Beatrice described threats from someone she identified as the pharmaceutical executive, and mysterious visitors who would park at the end of the driveway at night, watching the house. "They want what I've found," Beatrice wrote, "but they'll destroy it, patent it, control who gets access. I can't let that happen. What grows here could change everything, cure what they claim is incurable." The final entry sent chills down Julia's spine. "I've hidden everything where only someone who truly loves this land would find it. The seeds, the formulas, my research. It could change the world or destroy me. If you're reading this and I'm gone, be careful. They're still looking." Julia closed the journal, her mind racing. What had Beatrice discovered? And more importantly, was it still here, somewhere on her property? She glanced out the window at the overgrown garden, seeing it with new eyes. Those weren't just weeds out there. They might be something far more valuable. And if Beatrice's warnings were true, Julia might not be the only one looking for whatever secret this land held. Lucas and Emily couldn't contain their excitement after hearing Beatrice's story. They pestered Julia relentlessly about the hidden treasure mentioned in the journal. "Mum, we have to look for it," Lucas insisted, his eyes wide with anticipation. "What if there's actual gold or diamonds?" Emily added, practically bouncing on her toes. Julia hesitated at first, worried about getting their hopes up. But their enthusiasm was infectious, and truth be told, she was just as curious. "All right, treasure hunters," she finally agreed one Saturday morning. "Let's see what we can find." Armed with flashlights, gloves, and boundless curiosity, the trio ventured into parts of the property they hadn't fully explored. The old shed behind the house seemed the most promising place to start. Its weathered boards and rusted hinges suggested decades of neglect, perfect for hiding secrets. "Be careful of nails and splinters," Julia warned as they stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the earthy smell of decay. Cobwebs decorated every corner, and small creatures scurried away from the sudden intrusion of light. After an hour of careful searching, Emily's frustrated voice broke the silence. "There's nothing here but junk and bugs." But Lucas, who had been methodically tapping the floorboards, suddenly froze. "Listen," he whispered, tapping again. The hollow sound was unmistakable. Working together, they pried up several rotting boards to reveal a small space beneath. Julia shone her flashlight into the darkness, and there it was, a metal box, no bigger than a shoebox, covered in decades of dust. "The key," Emily gasped, remembering the brass key they'd found in the journal. Julia retrieved it from her pocket, her hands trembling slightly as she inserted it into the lock. It fit perfectly, turning with a satisfying click. Inside, they found no gold or jewels, but something potentially more valuable. Dozens of small glass vials containing dried plant matter and liquid extracts, carefully labeled in faded handwriting. Alongside these were folders filled with chemical formulas, diagrams of molecular structures, and detailed notes about extraction methods. At the bottom lay a sealed envelope. Julia carefully opened it and read aloud. "To the one who finds this, trust no one. They'll do anything to silence the truth." The three exchanged nervous glances. "What truth?" Lucas whispered. "And who's they?" Emily added, her earlier excitement now tinged with apprehension. Julia studied the formulas, her mind racing. These weren't random notes, they appeared to be research, possibly groundbreaking. Whatever Beatrice had discovered, someone had wanted it buried with her. And now, for better or worse, that secret was in their hands. Julia drove across town with the dusty box of files clutched to her chest, her mind racing. She hadn't called ahead. Something told her this needed to be done in person. When she arrived at the University Science Building, she found Dr. Patel working late, just as she used to during Julia's undergraduate days. "Julia, what a surprise," Dr. Patel said, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in its familiar bun. "It's been, what, 6 years?" "I need your expertise," Julia replied, placing the box on the lab table. "I found these in a hidden room in my new house. They belong to a woman named Beatrice Harmon." Dr. Patel's expression shifted as she opened the first folder. She adjusted her glasses, flipping through pages with increasing urgency. "Where did you say you found these?" she whispered. "Behind a false wall. Why? What is it?" Dr. Patel looked up, her face pale. "Julia, this woman, Beatrice, she was working on something extraordinary." Her fingers traced the chemical formulas. "This compound, it appears to target the precise autoimmune response in Harrington's disease without suppressing the entire immune system." "Harrington's? The one with no cure?" "Precisely. People diagnosed are given 5 years at most." Dr. Patel shuffled through more papers. "These calculations, these trials, they're decades ahead of current research. If this works, and her notes suggest it does, it would be worth billions." Julia felt a chill. Why would she hide this in a wall? "Because," Dr. Patel said, lowering her voice, "pharmaceutical companies would kill for this research. Literally." She gathered the papers quickly. "Listen carefully. Don't tell anyone about this. Not the police, not pharmaceutical representatives, not government agencies. Not yet. But shouldn't we share this? People are dying. And they'll continue to die if this falls into the wrong hands." Dr. Patel's eyes were intense. "Corporations will bury this research if it threatens their profit margins from current treatments. We need to verify it first, then find someone trustworthy to help develop it properly." Julia nodded slowly, the weight of her discovery sinking in. What had started as a desperate gamble on a $900 house had somehow placed her at the center of something that could change countless lives or put her own in danger. "I'll help you," Dr. Patel said, "but we must be extremely careful." Beatrice hid this for a reason. News of Julia's strange purchase had already begun circulating through the small town by sunset. Apparently, buying the most notorious abandoned property in the county was enough to make her the subject of hushed conversations at the diner and curious glances at the grocery store. She was still cleaning up when a sleek black SUV with tinted windows pulled into her driveway, its engine purring to a stop. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, his shoes crunching on the gravel as he approached. "Ms. Evans," he called out with a practiced smile. "I'm Richard Keller from the county assessor's office." He extended a business card that looked legitimate enough. "I understand you've acquired this property recently." Julia wiped her dusty hands on her jeans before accepting the card. "That's right. Just yesterday, actually." "Well, I'll be direct," he said, glancing around at the dilapidated house. "There's been some administrative confusion regarding this property. The county is prepared to offer you $20,000 to walk away. No questions asked, no paperwork headaches." His smile widened. "That's quite a profit on your $900 investment." Julia's heart hammered in her chest. $20,000 would solve so many problems. Back rent, Lily's braces, maybe even a reliable car. But something felt wrong. The county assessor showing up personally. With cash. And why would they pay so much for a property they'd practically given away? "I appreciate the offer," Julia said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice despite her trembling hands. "But I'm not interested in selling." The man's smile faltered, then disappeared entirely. His eyes hardened as he slipped the business card from her fingers. "I strongly suggest you reconsider, Ms. Evans. This property has complications you're not equipped to handle." "I'll take my chances," she replied, crossing her arms. The polite mask slipped completely as he turned to leave. At his car, he paused and looked back. "Some things aren't worth dying for, Ms. Evans." The threat hung in the air between them as he drove away, leaving Julia standing alone in the gathering darkness. She locked every door and window that night, jumping at every creak and rustle. What had she stumbled into? And more importantly, what was hidden in this house that was worth $20,000 to keep buried? Julia tucked Lucas into bed, kissed his forehead, and retreated to the kitchen to sort through the day's revelations. The house creaked around her, its secrets seemingly alive in the walls. Just as she was about to call Detective Morgan with an update, a wheezing sound from Lucas's room sent her heart racing. She burst through his door to find him sitting upright, desperately trying to catch his breath, his small hands clutching at his throat. "Can't breathe," he gasped, reaching for his inhaler on the nightstand. "It's okay, baby, I've got you," Julia said, grabbing the inhaler and placing it in his trembling hands. Lucas took 2 puffs, but his breathing didn't improve. If anything, it seemed worse. "Something's wrong," he wheezed, panic filling his eyes. Julia grabbed the inhaler, examining it closely under the bedroom light. She shook it. The weight felt right, but something wasn't adding up. Following a mother's instinct, she unscrewed the canister and sniffed the contents. Her blood ran cold. Water. Someone had replaced his medication with water. "We're going to the hospital," she said, wrapping him in a blanket and carrying him to the car, not even bothering to change out of her pajamas. 3 hours later, Lucas was stabilized in the emergency room. Julia sat beside his bed, watching his chest rise and fall with each breath, now assisted by proper medication. The doctor had confirmed her suspicion. The inhaler contained nothing but water, with trace amounts of the medication to maintain the smell. "This wasn't an accident," Detective Morgan said, standing in the doorway of the hospital room. Julia had called him from the car. Someone deliberately tampered with it. "They were in our house," Julia whispered, her voice breaking. "They were in his room, touching his things." The violation felt worse than any threat to her own safety. Whoever wants Beatrice's secret isn't just making threats anymore, Morgan said, his face grim. They're willing to hurt a child to get what they want. Julia looked at her sleeping son, tubes running from his arm, his face peaceful now that he could breathe again. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't about her anymore. This wasn't even about money or treasure or secrets. Someone had tried to harm her child, her entire world. I want you both in protective custody, Morgan continued, at least until we— No, Julia interrupted, a cold determination replacing her fear. We're not running. That house is ours, and whatever Beatrice left behind was meant for us to find. She stood up, her decision made. But I'm done being reactive. From now on, we set the traps instead of walking into them. Morgan studied her face. What are you planning? To use their desperation against them, she said, brushing Lucas's hair from his forehead. They think I don't know what Beatrice hid. Let's let them keep thinking that while we figure out who they are. Tom was adamant about Julia and Lucas staying with his family. I'm not taking no for an answer, he insisted, his voice firm but gentle. Not with everything that's happening. Julia wanted to protest, but found herself nodding instead. The thought of having someone to lean on after years of handling everything alone was overwhelming in the best possible way. That evening, as Lucas played video games with Tom's children in the living room, Julia and Tom sat on the back porch, mugs of tea warming their hands against the cool night air. I've never been so scared, Julia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. And not even during the divorce. Tom's hand found hers in the darkness. You're not alone in this anymore, he said, and something in his voice made her believe him completely. The next morning, Julia woke early and began the painstaking process of digitizing Beatrice's research. Dr. Patel had been clear. Make copies of everything. If what I suspect is true about these compounds, there are people who would go to great lengths to control this information. She photographed each page, each scribbled note, each diagram with meticulous care, uploading everything to 3 separate cloud accounts. By mid-morning, she was halfway through when Lucas burst into the room. "Mom, there's a fancy car coming up the driveway." Tom appeared behind him, his expression tense. "Stay inside," he said, moving toward the front door. The vehicle that rolled to a stop was sleek and black, with tinted windows that reflected the morning sun. The woman who emerged wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than Julia's monthly salary. Her heels clicked purposefully against the gravel as she approached. "Mrs. Harrison." The woman extended a manicured hand. "I'm Victoria Price, Vice President of Radcliffe Pharmaceuticals. I was hoping we might have a word." Julia felt Tom step closer to her. A silent show of support. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Price?" Julia asked, not taking the offered hand. Victoria's smile never faltered. "I understand you've recently inherited the old Blackwood property. Our company has had an interest in that land for some time." She opened her leather portfolio. "I'm authorized to offer you $250,000 for the house and all its contents. Cash offer, no inspections. Immediate closing." Julia's heart hammered in her chest. $250,000 would solve every financial problem she had. It would mean security for Lucas, a chance to start fresh without the constant worry about money. But then she thought of Beatrice's journals, the hidden lab, the warnings from Dr. Patel. "That's very generous," Julia said carefully, "but I'm not interested in selling at this time." Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I strongly encourage you to reconsider. This offer won't remain open indefinitely." Julia's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at Victoria's perfectly composed face. The sleek corporate office suddenly felt like a trap, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering no escape. "I don't understand," Julia said, her voice steadier than she felt. "What could possibly be on my property that would interest a company like Meridian Pharmaceuticals?" Victoria's smile remained fixed. hard as glass. "There are things on that land that belong to us, Mrs. Winters, things that were there long before you purchased that charming fixer-upper." Julia crossed her arms. "That's not an answer. If something's on my property, I deserve to know what it is. The previous owner had certain arrangements with us, arrangements we expected to continue regardless of ownership changes." Victoria slid a document across the polished table. "Our offer is more than generous. 10 times what you paid for that dilapidated farmhouse." Julia didn't touch the paper. "I've put everything I have into that home. My children are finally settling in. It's not for sale." Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers tapped once, twice against the table. "I strongly advise you to reconsider. This offer won't remain open indefinitely." "I'm not selling," Julia repeated, rising from her chair. Not without knowing what this is really about. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as Victoria's professional demeanor cracked. Her eyes turned cold, calculating. "You have 48 hours to reconsider, Mrs. Winters. After that, things might get complicated." The threat hung in the air, poisonous and unmistakable. "Are you threatening me?" Julia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Victoria stood, smoothing her skirt. "I'm simply explaining the reality of your situation. Small-town single mothers face so many challenges these days. Accidents happen. Building code violations are discovered. Child Services gets anonymous calls." Julia's blood ran cold. "Stay away from my family." 48 hours, Victoria repeated, gesturing toward the door. "I suggest you use that time wisely." The elevator ride down 17 floors gave Julia time to process what had just happened. This wasn't about zoning or development opportunities. Something was hidden on her property, something valuable enough that a pharmaceutical giant would resort to threats to obtain it. As she stepped into the parking garage, Julia's fear began transforming into something else: determination. Nobody was going to bully her out of her home, not after everything she'd sacrificed to make it theirs. Whatever Meridian wanted was on her land, which meant she had 48 hours to find it first. With Tom's help, Julia meticulously examined every inch of the property, tapping walls and checking for loose floorboards. They were standing in her bedroom when Tom noticed something odd about the wallpaper, a slight bulge that didn't match the pattern. Julia carefully peeled back the faded floral print, revealing a small, hollow space carved into the plaster. Her heart raced as she reached inside and pulled out a plastic bag sealed with yellowing tape. "Another cache," she whispered, carefully emptying the contents onto her bed. Inside were newspaper clippings from 40 years ago, all featuring Richard Price, the young CEO of Radcliffe Pharmaceuticals. Several threatening letters were paperclipped together, the handwriting angry and slanted. But what made Julia's breath catch was a small cassette tape at the bottom, labeled in shaky handwriting, October 17, 1983, the week Beatrice had disappeared. "We need to hear what's on this," Tom said, his voice tight with anticipation. Ruth was more than happy to lend them her old cassette player, though she raised an eyebrow when they asked, "Found something interesting?" "Did you?" she asked, but didn't press, when Julia gave a non-committal answer. Back at the house, Julia's fingers trembled as she inserted the tape and pressed play. Static crackled for several seconds before a woman's voice, Beatrice's voice, filled the room, breathless and frightened. "I'm recording this as evidence," she began. "He's been following me for days." Julia and Tom exchanged glances as the recording continued. A door slammed in the background, and a man's voice interrupted. "You're making a terrible mistake, Dr. Sullivan," the male voice said, smooth and controlled despite its menacing undertone. "Mr. Price, I've already told you my answer is no," Beatrice replied firmly. "Radcliffe Pharmaceuticals is prepared to offer you $5 million for your research," Richard Price said. "That's more than generous." "It's not about money," Beatrice shot back. "Your company will bury my discovery because it threatens your profit margins. People are dying while you—" Be reasonable, Price interrupted, his voice hardening. Things happen to people who stand in the way of progress, accidents, disappearances. Are you threatening me? Beatrice asked, her voice steady despite the clear danger. I'm offering you one last chance. Price replied coldly. Sell to us, or you won't live to regret it. The recording ended with the sound of a door slamming. Julia sat frozen, the implications washing over her. She had just heard Richard Price, still one of the most powerful men in the pharmaceutical industry, threatening Beatrice Sullivan's life. My God, Tom whispered, we just found a murder confession. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Julia stared at the document spread across her kitchen table, her hands trembling. The gravity of what she'd discovered was overwhelming. Corporate conspiracy, environmental cover-ups, and possibly murder. This wasn't just about saving her house anymore. Lives were at stake. After pacing the floor for nearly an hour, she made her decision. With shaking fingers, she dialed Dr. Patel's number. I have everything, she whispered into the phone. The memos, the test results, the internal emails, all of it. They knew about the contamination for years and buried it. Be careful, Dr. Patel warned. These people have resources we can't imagine. Her next call was to Elaine Winters, an investigative journalist whose exposés had brought down corrupt politicians. I need someone fearless, Julia explained, someone they can't easily silence. I'll be there tomorrow, Elaine promised. Don't discuss this with anyone else. Keep everything in a secure location, preferably not in your home. Julia followed the advice, making digital copies and storing them in multiple locations. But someone was watching. The next morning, she discovered her car wouldn't stop. The brake lines had been cut. Only her quick thinking and a fortunate downhill sandpit prevented disaster. 3 days later, Emma became violently ill after drinking tap water. Tests revealed the well had been poisoned with chemicals that matched those from the factory. Julia moved her daughter to her sister's house that same night, her heart breaking at their separation. The anonymous calls began the following week. Walk away from the house and the documents, a digitally altered voice instructed, or face unimaginable loss. You don't understand, Julia had shouted into the phone. I can't walk away. This isn't just about me anymore. Then you've made your choice, the voice replied before the line went dead. That night, Julia sat alone in her kitchen, jumping at every sound. The house she'd fought so hard to save now felt like a trap, but she'd come too far to surrender. Tomorrow, Elaine would publish the first piece in her investigative series. Dr. Patel had arranged for environmental regulators to collect samples. The evidence was secured. Julia checked the locks again and loaded the shotgun her father had given her years ago. She wasn't naive enough to believe the threats would stop once the story broke. In fact, she expected them to escalate. But she discovered something in herself these past weeks, something stronger than fear. The same determination that had led her to risk everything on this abandoned house would now see her through whatever came next. Lucas couldn't sleep for the 3rd night in a row. He tossed and turned, his small face scrunched with concentration when Julia checked on him at midnight. By morning, he appeared in the kitchen with dark circles under his eyes, but a determined expression. Mom, I keep seeing her. Beatrice is trying to tell me something, he insisted, pushing his cereal bowl away. She keeps pointing to the big oak tree. There's something underneath it. Julia exchanged glances with Tom, who had stayed over to help with more renovations. They'd learned not to dismiss Lucas's dreams, especially after everything that had happened. Which oak tree, buddy? Tom asked gently. The one with the swing. She keeps showing me how to count steps from the porch. That afternoon, the three stood beneath the massive oak where Julia had hung a tire swing weeks earlier. Lucas walked deliberately, counting under his breath, then stopped and pointed. Here. We need to dig here. Tom fetched shovels, and they began carefully removing earth. Julia felt ridiculous, yet couldn't ignore the goosebumps rising on her arms. After digging down nearly 3 feet, Tom's shovel hit something solid. "Oh, wait," he said, dropping to his knees to brush away dirt with his hands. Julia gasped as they uncovered a rectangular waterproof case, sealed tight and surprisingly well preserved. Her hands trembled as she popped the latches. Inside lay 3 items: an old VHS tape labeled simply "Insurance", a hand-drawn map with X marks in the state forest 20 miles away, and an envelope addressed, "To whoever finds this, please help me." Julia unfolded the letter inside, recognizing Beatrice's handwriting immediately. "If you're reading this, I'm probably dead," the letter began. "I've buried the real evidence deep in Westbrook State Forest. The coordinates are on the map. Richard Price threatened me after I discovered what his company was doing. The VHS contains my testimony naming him and others involved in the contamination cover-up. He said he'd hurt my daughter if I went public." Julia's voice broke as she read the final lines. "If anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident. I've hidden copies of everything with my attorney too, but Price doesn't know about this backup. Please make sure justice is served, for my daughter's sake." Tom placed his hand on Julia's shoulder. "We need to call Detective Wilson right now." Lucas looked up at them both, his eyes wide. "She can rest now, can't she?" "Beatrice can finally rest." Julia knew something was wrong when the sheriff couldn't meet her eyes. He shuffled his feet on her porch, raindrops dripping from his hat as he handed her the official-looking papers. "I'm sorry, Ma'am. This injunction requires you to vacate the premises within 48 hours due to procedural errors in your purchase." His voice was flat, rehearsed. "Procedural errors? After 3 months? Who's behind this?" Julia's voice cracked. The sheriff glanced nervously at his patrol car. "Just doing my job. But between us, this came from way above my pay grade." After he left, Julia slammed her fist against the wall. The system was rigged, just as she'd suspected. Richard Price was using his connections to force her out before she could expose what she'd found. "Mom!" Tom stood in the doorway, Ruth beside him clutching Beatrice's journal. "What are we going to do?" Julia looked at the evidence they'd gathered, the ledgers, the notes, the maps. "We're going to follow Beatrice's final clue. Tonight." The thunderstorm intensified as darkness fell. Rain lashed against them as Julia led Tom and Ruth into the forest behind the property, flashlights cutting weak paths through the downpour. "This way!" Julia shouted over the thunder, comparing Beatrice's hand-drawn map to their surroundings. She marked something near the old oak with the lightning scar. They trudged through ankle-deep mud, the storm's fury intensifying with each step. A lightning bolt struck nearby, illuminating the forest in harsh white light. "There!" Ruth pointed to an ancient oak tree, its trunk split by an old lightning strike. Tom began digging where Beatrice had marked an X, his hands soon hitting something solid. Together, they unearthed a steel lockbox, rusted but intact. Back at the house, huddled around the kitchen table in wet clothes, Julia broke the lock. Inside lay a sealed envelope marked "Last Will and Testament of Beatrice Harmon," notarized and dated just 2 weeks before her disappearance. "Look at these," Tom whispered, pulling out a stack of photographs protected in plastic. The timestamp showed 3 a.m. on the night Beatrice vanished. There, clear as day, was Richard Price on the property, carrying what looked like a shovel. "And this," Ruth added, unfolding research papers documenting illegal waste disposal on land adjacent to the development, land owned by Price's shell company. Julia's hands trembled as she realized what they'd found. "This isn't just about my house anymore. This is evidence of what happened to Beatrice." The thunder seemed to answer her words with a deafening crack, as if Beatrice herself was acknowledging the truth finally coming to light. With the journalist's connections and Dr. Patel's scientific expertise, Julia compiled an ironclad case. They spent 3 sleepless nights organizing Beatrice's research journals, financial records, and the damning voice recordings. When they finally presented everything to the FBI, the special agent's eyes widened. "This is bigger than anything we imagined," he said, taking the evidence with gloved hands. Within 48 hours, the story exploded across every major news outlet. "A pharmaceutical giant built on murder and stolen research," screamed the headlines. Julia watched in disbelief as her face appeared on national television, described as the divorced mother who risked her last $900 and uncovered one of the biggest corporate crimes of the decade. The public was captivated by every detail. How a brilliant female scientist had been silenced. How her groundbreaking cancer treatment had been stolen by Radcliffe Pharmaceuticals. And how a struggling single mother had stumbled upon the truth while simply trying to rebuild her life. Social media erupted with hashtags supporting Julia and demanding justice for Beatrice. Radcliffe's stock plummeted 83% in a single day. Former employees came forward with corroborating stories. The CEO and 3 board members were led away in handcuffs, their faces splashed across the same business magazines that had once celebrated them as visionaries. "Your temporary injunction has been permanently lifted," Julia's lawyer announced over the phone, his voice triumphant. "The judge has not only granted you full ownership of the property, but also ruled that all of Dr. Beatrice Chen's intellectual property rights transfer to you as the property owner and discoverer of her work." Dr. Patel squeezed Julia's hand. "Beatrice would have wanted this. Her research will help millions, just as she intended." The irony wasn't lost on Julia. She had purchased the farmhouse, hoping it might somehow save her financially. Instead, it had saved her in ways she could never have imagined, and would now save countless lives through Beatrice's treatment protocol. "Mom." Emma appeared in the doorway, holding a framed photo they'd found of Beatrice in her garden. "Can we plant sunflowers for her this spring?" Julia nodded, tears welling in her eyes. The house that had once felt like her last desperate gamble now felt like exactly where they were meant to be all along. 6 months later, the once-abandoned farmhouse buzzed with life and purpose. Julia stood on the freshly painted porch, watching the afternoon sun cast golden light across the thriving gardens that now stretched where weeds had once claimed dominance. With Tom's muscle and Ruth's encyclopedic knowledge of local growing conditions, they had carefully restored Beatrice's botanical legacy. Rare medicinal herbs grew in neat beds, their leaves dancing in the gentle breeze, while butterflies and bees performed their essential work among the blossoms. "Mom, the 3 o'clock tour is here," Lucas called from the gravel driveway, where a small group of visitors waited eagerly. Julia smiled as her son bounded down the steps, clipboard in hand, confidence radiating from him. The change in him over these months had been nothing short of miraculous. His asthma attacks, once a terrifying weekly occurrence, had dwindled to almost nothing since they'd moved to the farmhouse. Dr. Wilson remained baffled but pleased, suggesting something about the air quality or perhaps the herbal teas Julia brewed from Beatrice's recipes. The Beatrice Bennett Botanical Sanctuary sign swung gently from its post as Lucas began explaining the history of the property to the visitors. Julia had used a portion of the money from selling just 3 of the rarest specimens from Beatrice's collection to fund the restoration, keeping her promise to preserve rather than profit. The remaining funds had gone into establishing a small business, selling medicinal teas and tinctures made from plants grown on the property, providing enough income that Julia no longer woke in the night panicking about bills. Ruth waved from the herb garden where she was teaching 2 young women how to properly harvest lavender. The elderly neighbor had become family, spending most days sharing her knowledge and stories about Beatrice with anyone who would listen. Tom, too, had found his place here, managing the structural maintenance of the property and leading weekend workshops on sustainable building practices in the renovated barn. As twilight approached and the last visitors departed, Julia settled into the rocking chair that had become her favorite spot. From here, she could see the entire property, the gardens, the small greenhouse they'd built in spring, the path leading to the pond where Lucas often sat, reading or sketching. She pulled Beatrice's journal from her pocket, its pages now familiar and comforting. "We did it, Beatrice," she whispered, running her fingers over the faded handwriting. "Your home is alive again." The breeze seemed to strengthen for just a moment, carrying the scent of herbs and possibility. Julia smiled, no longer afraid of what tomorrow might bring. From $900 and desperate courage had grown something beautiful, a legacy, a home, and a future brighter than she had ever dared to dream.